Hey everybody, I'm Michael Ruckman, President and CEO of Senteo. Today we're continuing our talks with thought leaders on the topic of surviving and thriving in the time of coronavirus. We're talking today with MIkhail Myagkov, a PhD in game theory, and we've got a lot to talk about. Good morning, Misha. It seems this is going to be an interesting discussion. You are a Russian who spent most of the last couple decades living and working in the U.S. in Oregon, and I'm an American who spent most of the last couple decades living and working in Russia. So we have a few things to talk about. But the list of things, aside from being a professor at the University of Oregon and a PhD in game theory, cognitive theory. I mean, the list is too long. Why don't you say a few words about yourself?
Well, thanks, Michael. So, yeah, it's really great. We live in very interesting times. I don't think we ever would expect or could have predicted how things are going to turn out and what sort of skills and what kind of scientific knowledge about human decision making is going to be needed for us to better understand how we're going to survive this crisis, how we're going to live after that, because a lot of our strategies, a lot of our plans should be based upon understanding of how human beings make decisions under situations of uncertainty, fear, situations where it's not where they have no experience how to deal with various challenges. And in this respect, I think it's really important to bring all this knowledge that we've accumulated in last many decades in cognitive sciences and game theory, in behavioral economics and behavioral politics to actually make societies better. And, you know, all my life, back in the Soviet Union, and then in the United States, and then back in Russia for the last many years, I've been studying just one thing. I've been studying how people make decisions. That was essentially the topic of my research when I was a young undergraduate at uh, Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology, studying game theory. Of course, it was Soviet times, so all these decision-making related sciences were part of mathematics. I mean, everything else was fairly ideological. Back in the US, I was really lucky to be part of Caltech community where folks there study social sciences with same scientific vigor as they do biology and chemistry and physics. And then again, I've been using data, big data, small data, experimental analysis to uh, gain more knowledge about how we make decisions, how we act and react in the variety of situations which are challenging for human brain. And I
Wow.
think,
Let me ask you a question then. So this whole, let's say, change in our behavior and being locked down and all of these things that have happened in the last uh, 4, 5, 6, 8 weeks. I mean, it's just been kind of a snowball going down the hill. But all of these changes in our lives have brought about some very interesting choices that people are making. You know, did the whole thing around toilet paper, which I still don't understand, but to protesting social distancing, which doesn't make a lot of sense when everybody is saying that, for example, well, there's two schools, I guess. One of them is we need to stay on the path to herd immunity. The other one is let's not break the medical system, the healthcare system, by having the curve too high. So flattening the curve. So, the whole concept of protesting that to get a haircut seems like it puts a lot of people in danger. But there's what are the underlying then reasons for why people are making these strange decisions and behaving the way they are?
well, you know, the issues and the problems that we're seeing right now are not, it's not something new, or it's not something that in any way, shape, or form, any kind of puzzle. I mean, in reality, we've seen similar problems occurring in the society over the past, many, many years when, uh, to put it simple, uh, there is a conflict between what our nature or what our brain want us to do, something that evolved through the process of evolution over the last depending on which evolutionary theorist, you believe, 50,000 years, they claim, since the weight of the human brain didn't change, or millions of years, that's when the hardware of human brain has been evolving. But basically, we are programmed to like, want, prefer certain things, and we are programmed to react with caution, fear, aggression, and so on to certain other things. That's what's inside us. And then there are sort of societal norm and challenges that are put on those desires, preferences, fears, and so on and so forth, which are basically designed to help societies control us better, to kind of uh, put human energy or human decision making into certain, collective action outcomes that the governments or certain groups want. I mean, again, I could give you many examples of that, but what we're seeing now is very simple. First and foremost, human beings are social animals. We evolved as being social animals. Sociality, being with others, is not just what we like. It's one of the resources that we need to survive. It's like, water, fresh air, food that we need for normal survival. We need sociality. I mean, you like it or not. People are designed to live in social groups. Many years ago, it was impossible to survive without being not just part of the social group, but without being accepted by the social group, without being the kind of normal member of the social group. So we have all sorts of cognitive skills, preferences, and so on and so forth, all this apparatus, which essentially the evolution designed for us to help us live in the society. And once we're deprived of that, the brain starts acting like something is broken, right? Right, like there is fear. Brain starts fearing for us that we are not going to survive because we are deprived of social interactions. And it's normal that people naturally, with some people who are not so much kind of interested in abiding to what the governments tell them, kind of follow what their brains tell them, and go out there and protest and make all sorts of noise about how sick and tired they are. So at that point, their brain is not thinking about the rationale, all these reasons why the government is doing that. It's simply our animal instinct, if you want.
And it's a good excuse to go out and be with other people. Go out and protest, yeah. Interesting. We talked also about uncertainty as one of the drivers. The unknown
Yes.
Tends to make people behave in very strange ways.
Exactly, you're absolutely right. Another thing, again, we have known this for many years from all sorts of research, that people are generally risk averse. In other words, in a simple lottery between getting, $100 for sure, or having a 50-50 chance between $200 or nothing, we tend to prefer the certain outcome. We tend to prefer $100 for sure. Uh, Again, the way human brains are programmed, in most cases, and again, there are exceptions which I don't want to go too much into details. Usually they're connected to younger people who are at the prime of their kind of reproductive age, which is, believe it or not, is about 16 or 17, and not what we think. People tend to take much higher risk and like risk and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, people who are adults, they don't like risk. They don't. They prefer to be risk averse. They prefer to avoid risk. Different people, different kind of circumstances, put different values on risk avoidance. But we don't like being in a situation where the outcomes are uncertain. I mean, think why insurance companies are making so much money, right?
Yeah,
It's not just because some of those insurances are, mandatory, just because people like paying those companies to help them avoid risk.
I like in Las Vegas in the casinos. All of the casinos have these kind of cheat cards for different games. So it's a little card that tells you the rules to play blackjack or the rules for craps or whatever. and they have to give you the honest, in order to be fair, the regulators of gaming force them to tell you the honest rules, right? And so
Right.
on the little card, it says insurance is a bad idea.
you know,
Yeah.
my favorite in Vegas was always those boards, kind of advertising boards on the casinos, which would say our slot machines like pay 98 cents on a dollar or something
Yeah.
like that. When you think about this, basically what it tells you, it says, look, come on in, give us a dollar, we'll give you 98 cents back. And
Yeah. Well,
yeah,
and actually, all of those say specifically, like for example, on blackjack, I think it's 4%. Like statistically, if you play long enough, the
right,
house has a 4% advantage if you play by the rules. If you start doing strange things, then all bets are off, so to speak.
right.
But if you play according to the rules and the statistical norms, then your risk is really only about 4% if you play long enough, and so on. So people that this is kind of another fun thing. People that play, there's this theory in blackjack where, like, when you start losing, at some point you have to win again. So every time you lose, you double your bet. And then if you have the stomach to handle that, eventually you'll win and you'll be back where you started. But most people give up before they get to that.
Well, I had a friend of mine I still have who's also a mathematician, and he told me, listen, and we were both these brand new graduate students. I was at Caltech, he was at BYU, and of course Las Vegas is somewhere in between. So he went to Vegas and he said, listen, it's so simple. You just put $10 on red, and if it's black, you double the bet,
Yeah.
and then you basically keep doubling the bet since you just wait till it's red, and in the end you win. And then he called me up like a few months later, and he said, I never thought you can get like 10 black in a row,
Yeah.
and I did.
Yeah. That's the
And
thing.
that's how he lost all the money.
Well, and that's it goes back to the statistical thing again, right? Each
Right,
roll of the dice, or each deck of cards, or each
right,
ball roulette table is completely independent from the previous.
right, exactly. And
So
again, look, when my students, and I've been teaching statistics for ages, when my students ask me, Misha, so how do we win in Vegas? I say, well,
don't play.
basically the statistical rule is very simple. Uh, the more you play, the more you lose. That's very simple.
Yeah.
That's just what statistical rules, and statistical rules are kind of like laws of physics. I mean, you can't really defy them, and you can't really argue against them. But what you can do, if you want to have a decent chance of winning, you make one or two large bets, and whatever happens, you walk away. And
Yeah.
this way, you have slightly less than 50% chance of winning, and slightly more than 50% chance of losing. And if you are happy with that, then that's what you do.
Yeah.
But
They call that
what
the hit and run.
exactly? I
Yeah.
didn't know that, by the way.
Yeah, it's called the hit and run. You hit it, you win it, and you get out of there before you lose it again. So coming back to the current crisis and all the behavior out there, so this is the third video series that we're doing, and we've been talking a lot about behavior and new habits that form. And so from this kind of uncertainty, loss aversion, risk aversion, the kind of sociality concepts and things like that, if we think about the changes in our behavior just over the last couple months, I mean, I walk outside to go to the supermarket and I look at everybody like a potential carrier of coronavirus. And it's actually changing our behavior in a significant way. And we were talking about retail and what the long-term effects of this will be on how people shop and how people behave and how people go to events or spaces that for entertainment and so on. What are your thoughts on the long-term effects of this?
Well, let me tell you something very important here. You mentioned loss aversion, and this is one of those sort of key kind of pieces of scientific knowledge that is also very helpful in understanding, like basically trying to answer your question. I believe one of the greatest scholars and thinkers of our modern times is Daniel Kahneman, who is a Nobel
Mm-hmm.
laureate, and who invented this very simple theory of human behavior under risk, which is called prospect theory. That's
Mhm.
what he got Nobel Prize for. And one of the key ideas there is that our behavior, our risk attitudes, and rationality of our behavior greatly depends on framing, on how we frame the situation we're in. Are we in the domain of gains? Are we about to gain something with certain probabilities? Or are we in the domain of losses? In other words, is this whole thing can lead us to lose certain things, our salaries, our house, our lifestyle, you name it. And what happens, again, because of all sorts of various evolutionary reasons, as those theorists would argue, that once we find ourselves in the domain of loss, we basically become irrational. We become much more risk loving, which we shouldn't, much more risk accepting. That's why Vegas people want you to lose a little bit, and then once that happens, you are basically at their mercy because your brain switches to this loss and risk accepting behavior, and you start losing more and more. So same thing happens in our society now. And by the way, we've seen very similar reaction after, say, September 11th of 2001, after terrorist attacks. Once people find themselves in a situation of uncertainty where they believe loss uh, is likely, our brain be becomes screwed, so to speak.
Mhm.
50,000 years ago, any kind of loss probably meant death. So your brain start acting like you're about to die, and you're willing to do whatever it takes to avoid death. Like you, at the beginning of this talk, you mentioned this toilet paper example, right?
Mhm.
Completely irrational, completely stupid. But that's a reaction to the probability of losing the opportunity to have toilet paper, right?
Mhm.
You make all sorts of irrational moves. You may remember again after September 11th, people were walking around the streets looking at people who look like Muslims, and they all look to them like potential terrorists, right?
Well, they
Imagine
did the same. They did the same thing with Asian people.
exactly.
I'm calling it the Chinese virus. And I read, well, I heard from a friend. I still haven't found the actual article, but I heard from a friend that read an article that over 1.5 million guns have been sold over the last 2 months in the U.S. Which is also, and actually two friends of mine on a Zoom call showed me their shiny new pistols that they bought to protect themselves because they're waiting for civil unrest in the U.S.
Right. I mean, look, you're absolutely right. Uh, a lot of, I mean, what what we observe, not just in the United States or in Russia, but largely around the world. In fact, Russia, I think, in many ways, again, as a country, probably behaves a little bit more rationally than, say, the United States, but also not without certain issues and problems. We see a lot of irrational behavior. We see a lot of sort of misinterpretation of probabilities, a lot of misforecasting of what's going to happen. We fail to compare what we observe now in terms of the number of deaths of coronavirus, the probabilities of dying, and so on and so forth, with all sorts of other challenges that we face in life, like serious diseases, like you mentioned in the beginning, serious social problems where people basically go nuts.
Mhm.
Uh, People lose their livelihoods, people lose jobs, they lose businesses. Uh, the social and educational and moral sort of consequences, the results of this are still very much unknown. But what we do know, and this is where I think science just screams at us to become more rational, is that our brains act in a way that they are completely in a survival mode, which is totally uh, not suitable for 21st century because those survival modes have been evolved in our brain 50 or 100,000 years ago, depending on
Mhm.
which theorist you believe. So we are acting under a computer program which had been programmed back when the societal and other challenges had been completely different. So that's why we should really look and study our response after September 11th, after other, similar events where people were driven by fear, by uncertainty, learn lessons and understand that, again, this stuff we should just handle with calm rationality and reasonable assessment of probabilities of all the pluses and minuses of policies that we make.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So just to switch topics a tiny bit, we did a talk like this with Joe Pine just over a week ago, and we were talking about shopping experiences, and I think your let's say view on this would be really interesting as a game theorist and understanding the decisioning and so on. It would be interesting because one of the things we were talking about was the fact that everybody's learning how to buy online. Even people that had never bought online before are now actively purchasing online. And one of the effects we were saying is it's going to be difficult for offline retailers to get people back into their stores, and especially with all of this fear and so on of going back out and without a vaccine and all of that. But talking about the online retailers, we were talking about the fact that it's going to drive prices down. And the online retailers will have to learn how to differentiate and engage people in a different way. And so we didn't touch on it in that talk, but I think it's very relevant to talk about it with you in terms of how to use game theory and how to kind of get people more engaged in online environments. We've talked about this quite a bit before in terms of getting people's attention and holding their attention with specific rewards for that and so on. That maybe just your view on that would be interesting.
Yes, absolutely. I think that again, this word gamification, and let me make sure you understand, put it in a kind of right format, is very important.
Yeah.
But I think what's really important is to move a little one level higher and look at this from sort of 30,000 feet, as we say, and understand what's really important. What I think is really important is this sort of customer-based experience and marketing approach, which essentially makes people feel like they're part of some group, of some community, that somebody cares about them, and somebody feels that they are important, that they are in a situation where they haven't been left out, that they're not forgotten, that there are some certain social interactions and so on and so forth. So effectively, what I was talking about before about this need for sociality, need for social environment, designed in a correct way, it's something that our brain wants, like, they want food, water, and so on and so forth. The deprivation of that is causing people to change their habits, and change of those habits translates into change how they buy, how they interact with retailers. So I think those companies which will figure out how to combine this idea of bringing people into groups and environments and social interactions with manufacturers, retailers, and so on and so forth, will be much more successful. And in this respect, again, gamification of the process is one of the tools that can be used and actually being used successfully by certain companies and certain people, which produces very good results. Because what is game? I mean, look, in the game theory 101 class, the first thing I start with, I'm saying, look, to have any kind of game, you need at least two people.
Yep.
I mean, any kind of game is an interaction, right? So so you interact with somebody, you use your strategy, they use their strategy, and again, we naturally like that because it's part of this sociality, it's part of the social environment. So I think use of gamification, all sorts of different gamification strategies. We're now working and looking at in our experimental environment at various gamification strategies that we never thought about before, because we never thought that there will be such challenge, such need for applied game theory like there is now. is going to be very productive, I believe.
You know, this is an interesting topic because we've been working with game theory, gamification for years in complex pricing systems and loyalty programs and so on. And one of the things that I always say, and I think there's a huge opportunity right now because of the change in behavior. The opportunity is not necessarily to make the mistakes that a lot of companies have made trying to gamify things by putting leaderboards and progress trackers and badges and and different levels of bronze, silver, gold, platinum, and so on to try and keep people engaged like that. Actually using these theories to influence behavior for good. So actually helping your customer to become better, helping your customer to achieve the goals that they set out to achieve, and so on. And I've talked about this many times with I say in a health club, for example. If my health club was focused on the experience and the transformational nature of why I go there versus the service that they provide of a membership to a space with a bunch of equipment, they would have a much better business model. Because if somebody says, hey, you're going to pay $50 or $100 a month to have access to all of this equipment, okay, whatever. If somebody says, hey, you're going to pay $500 a month, but in 3 months you'll be 20 pounds lighter, I'd probably pay it. I would probably pay that. And so this concept of using these theories and the underlying psychology of behavior to help people become better is kind of interesting right now. I think there's a huge opportunity, and maybe this is the time to try those things. Your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the key word that you said is engagement. In this day and age, engagement is a very valuable commodity because 2 months ago we were engaged all the time, right? We were engaged with our kids, with their teachers, with our coworkers, with friends in the bars, and so on and so forth. So essentially, most of our normal lives before this pandemic were about engagement. You go to a department store, you engage with the salesperson there. You go to your kid's school, you engage with other parents, teachers, and so on and so forth. So now engagement is in very short supply, and in retail industry, in essentially interacting with customers, I think customer engagement something that we can actually do through all sorts of different gamification tools and other kind of tools become not just important, but you're absolutely right. It's a great opportunity. That opportunity didn't exist before. I mean, the value of human attention, and of course you need attention to get into engagement. The value of human attention to anything was very high. Basically, for you to pay attention to any sort of advertising or marketing or attempt to engage by a retail chain or whatnot was very high. I mean, the cost of that, because you had all these other things you were busy doing, and you really didn't have time for that, and you didn't have need for that. So now, sort of in a perfect storm way, in a positive sense of that, two very important things come together. You have time, and by you I mean consumers, and you have need, right?
Yep.
So that's why I think now more than ever, suddenly the opportunity for customer engagement based models become at the top of what those companies, what those retail chains and so on should be looking at. And at the same time, again, the good news that there is a lot of experimental, scientific, corporate research, which basically has all the tools available for them to try.
Yeah, the tools are there, and the
Yes.
data are there. We were having a conversation last week about how much data organizations have and how little they actually use. So my example was I got a survey from my mobile operator, and the first question was, which of our services do you use? And I thought, well, why do you need to ask me that? You should know that. So, thinking about the data and being able to use the data to help people as well. We did a project with a bank a few years ago, and we implemented a goal-oriented savings program. And we said,
Mm-hmm.
wow, you know, people save with roughly the same discipline that they go to the health club to try and lose weight, right? So you have a good idea, you start saving for that idea, you save for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, and then life happens and your focus changes and you move on to other things. And we said, let's use the data. Let's actually identify the behavioral patterns, and let's find a way to automate responses to that. So if we start, you know, if we know that savings discipline drops off in month 3, let's start engaging people a little more in month 2 and saying, hey, you're doing a great job, don't stop, think about your goal, and so on. Or if we know, for example, that savings discipline falls off around Christmas time, because people are spending money on other things, let's deal with that ahead of time and say, hey, maybe you want to save a little bit more in October, November, because you're going to have all these extra expenses in December, and so on. So actually using the data and using the knowledge that an organization has about behavioral patterns, behavioral scenarios, is another opportunity, I think, that nobody's really touched on, that's gonna be an opportunity now.
Yeah, this is it's another very, very interesting issue that you're suggesting. If you go online and look at, say, Google Analytics, and look at the frequency of Google searches on the word big data,
Mm-hmm.
so what you'll find is that basically up until about 2008, 2010, there's none, right?
Yeah.
This whole sort of idea of data-driven approach to solve marketing, corporate, societal, political, and all these other problems actually happened just in the last, few years. And the reason why it's happened, and again, this is where this other great opportunity now exists suddenly in this new world that we're living in, is because people in their activities and their actions started leaving what we call digital footprints or digital traces.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very simple. What's happened in 2008 or around that time?
Yeah.
Well, the emergence of iPhones, right? The emergence of first really usable smartphones that people could, buy airplane tickets, look at the maps, browse the internet, and so on and so forth. And all that leaves data. So that data combined with data that corporations have on, say, consumer behavior of their customers, when they buy, what they buy. They got, loyalty cards. They got digital footprints of where their customers go. They know kind of how well they're paying their bills, and so on and so forth. That combined essentially gives us this huge array of information that, if analyzed and used in the right way, can actually not just improve their marketing strategies, raise their sales, but can actually change the way, going back to our previous point, how they engage with customers. And that's really important because, like you said, giving customers some ribbons or making them like higher status and so on and so forth, it's kind of nice, but it really doesn't do anything about raising the customer's feel of being engaged and being part of the social environment of whatever company is out there.
Yeah.
And that's something that I think is going to change. And this is where big data, even though it's sort of strange term, right? What is small data? What is big data? But data-driven approach to solving many of our problems is really the future. And I think that now that we have capacity to store data, we have capacity to transmit data, we have capacity to analyze data. I think the next several decades are going to be about content, going to be about content analysis, and the companies which are going to be doing it right and using the right tools for their purposes are going to be the leaders.
There's you and I talked about this the other day. This guy Seth Pribach, who actually, interesting presentation I saw from him a number of years ago, where he talked about what he calls the social layer and the game layer, using
Right.
game theory and game dynamics to actually influence behavior. And he says, there was a period of 10, 12 years where this kind of social layer was formed, creating all of the connections between people on social networks and so on. And his idea is that the next 10, 12, 15 years will be about using that interconnectivity and also using the data that we get from digital footprints to actually influence behavior. And hopefully this happens not just to sell more, but to create good. Because if we look over the last 10 years at how companies have used data, they've used it just to try and sell more. And one of the funny things, I always say that the data has always been there. It's just up until about the last 10, 12 years, we didn't have the ability to capture it, process it, and come to some reasonable conclusions in a reasonable period of time. You could have, if it was 20 years ago, you could have, studied people for a decade to come to some conclusion. And now we can do it in minutes. So that it's just the technology has changed, but it provides a lot of opportunity. And for those organizations that are not purely self-serving, but choose to use that data and to use game theory and game dynamics to engage people and help them to achieve some goal, I think the opportunity is huge. The other thing that we talked about that I wanted to bring up was how all of this affects education. You as a university professor obviously have an opinion on that, and I think it would be interesting because using the data, teaching remotely, being able to use tools for engagement and helping people to achieve their educational goals faster, more efficiently, whatever. What do you think?
Well, look, there are there are so many questions on this one. One of my really good friends and the president of one of the best universities in Russia, Tomsk State University, uh, likes to say that, and he was saying that even before this pandemic and everything, whatever educational innovation and changes we make, they should be disruptive. They shouldn't be just innovative. They should really be disruptive. We should really change the way we acquire information or transfer information. And of course, when we're talking about those disruptive mechanisms, all sorts of online data transmissions were coming to mind. Information transmission, knowledge transmission, but nobody kind of really knew what it meant. So now suddenly we are running this huge experiment, which we would never be able to run at normal times, where suddenly all of the information in the educational environment gets transmitted online, gets disseminated remotely, and so on and so forth. And what we see is something that I, for example, have been preaching for many years, and in fact have been practicing for many years, that in modern education, we can really separate delivery of content and delivery of context to
Mhm.
students. In other words, I mean, you can easily deliver a whole bunch of content through all sorts of online tools and means. Like, if I'm teaching my students about Nash equilibrium and game theory class, there are zillions of websites and Wikipedia links and all sorts of things which are going to explain them in very simple and very high quality way what it is, give them all sorts of examples, and it's going to take them 20 minutes to go through this, and I don't have to spend time in my classroom teaching them that.
Yeah.
But what I think you cannot really avoid, and this is where I totally disagree with those forecasters who say that now that we've tried this and kind of like this, all the education is going to go online and universities are going to sort of shrink and we'll be delivering online classes. I'm completely, I think it's not going to happen. I think if it were to happen, it would be totally wrong, so on and so forth, because what, um, what good professors can do, they can actually make students smarter. Uh, and they can make them smarter by engaging them with, and again, this is the word engagement. I think it's one of the key words of today's conversation. They can engage them with the context of that content that they can be learning online. So they basically can tell them how to use this or can help them understand how to use the information that they acquire, how to critically think about the data, which now becomes kind of the big part of our life, how to apply that critical thinking about the data, and it applies to social sciences as much as it applies to mathematics and physics and biology, of course, to actually make better decisions, how to be more informed citizens, how to live better lives. So that's where I think the disruptive role of this pandemic and the disruptive role of this tectonic changes in education is going to be that professors, the faculty members who are capable of just departing from this kind of normal, boring way of delivering content to students and then giving them, tests and quizzes and giving them grades based on how well they memorize the content. So if they can depart from this and become disseminators of context and helping students engage with this content, with this context, then the universities are going to become much better places.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that is interesting. I think that goes across all, not just adult education, but all levels of education, both short-term, long-term, formal, informal, whatever. But we had a textbook publisher as a client with a digital strategy. And we said, you can't just digitize your content and expect that that's going to solve everything. You have to think about the delivery mechanism. So, the equivalent of Napster and iTunes, if we compare those. But, we said, let's look at the opportunity, because the education system for children, well, most education systems are designed for an average learner.
Right.
So if they're designed at the pace that an average learner would learn. So if you learn faster, you're bored. If you learn slower, you're not identified soon enough and don't get the help that you need in a timely manner. And we said, if you're going to digitize, then you can actually gamify the content so that it's more engaging. You won't have to stand there and look over people to make sure they're learning the content and so on. But then if you break it down into small enough modules, you could customize it and allow people to move through it at their own speed. The people that and because it's digital and we have the data, we can actually identify people that need help and help them sooner, or identify topics where people are excelling faster and put those people on a fast track and so on. But then we said the biggest opportunity is the change in the role of the teacher, which is what you just said. So the teacher then doesn't have to focus on content delivery, but they can focus on problem solving and application of concepts to hypothetical scenarios, or even real life scenarios, to teamwork and social context and things like that. And so the opportunity is huge here. And I think now that part of this delivery, that people have gotten used to it being digital and remote, there's an opportunity to change the, let's say, education experience that happens in the physical world, so that it's more about what you say, context and learning how to apply things versus always, forcing the content side. I like it. I think that's a huge opportunity for education.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you've been just talking about, this is called adaptive learning. And
Yeah.
now there is this explosion of various projects and researchers and programs which are focused on exactly that, on adaptive learning.
Yeah.
Because think about this. Now, again, going back to this data, going back to this big data, once we have a student, we know we can collect data about that student on pretty much everything. We know, how often he or she attends lectures, what kind of talents they have, how engaged they are, where the weaknesses are, where the strengths are, what kind of talents. I mean, the data is so helpful for us that we can, based on the data, we can create those mechanisms of adaptive learning, which are going to be much more effective vehicles of content delivery than what we have now. And then professor is going to have basically a dashboard, which is going to inform professor about pretty much every student individual, skills, interests, how much content they actually learn, so that professor can actually customize what they do, how they engage in that context, based on the data, based on the much better understanding of who the students are. And I think we're going to be in a much more effective and interesting world of delivering that stuff. Of course, what you need for this, you need a bunch of really uh, smart professors. Maybe not, I mean, look, all professors believe that they're smart, right? But you need a lot of professors who actually have this religion of being engaged with disruptive technologies and actually willing to make students smarter as opposed to just giving them the content. And I think this is where kind of the main challenge is. Academia in general is a very kind of robust and inertia sort of prone system. It's really hard to reform academia. It's very hard to move things. It takes years, if not multiple decades. So that's kind of something that gives me a little bit of caution. I can see how much resistance there will be in academia to any kind of reform.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and that's where I think there will be what we are going to see. We're going to see some universities which are willing to take up on those challenges, which are willing to adapt to these new realities, are going to be rising to prominence faster than others.
Mm-hmm. That's a good, let's say, an analogy of the education system is going to move slowly. That's for sure. But interesting. I saw recently a TED talk from a guy named Ricardo Selner, who in the 90s started changing his company in Brazil, and his whole kind of concept was that managing people is really kind of a pain in the ass, and
Uh-huh.
how do you design a self-organizing, self-managed organization? And so they started kind of changing the way that they pay people, and they said, let's not focus on the amount of time that you're spending here. Let's focus on the result of your work. And if you're overproductive, don't bring that to us because it just creates more problems. It's better if we know that, he says, if you're supposed to produce 57 widgets and you do that by Wednesday, don't produce more because that causes more problems. Just go to the beach for a couple days and come back and start over next Monday. But so when they made all these changes, it was interesting because they also had two open board seats that could be taken with equal voting rights, that could be taken by anybody who showed up. So often they would have a janitor taking decisions on the board and so on. But they did that in a way to create let's say, a self-organizing, self-managed organization.
Mm-hmm.
And then they thought, okay, where do we find people that are right for this? So they started a couple different schools. I think they have 3 different schools. And they said, how do we make these schools self-managed as well? So they mixed all ages based on the topic that people were studying, not based on an age progression. And they did something. They said, why don't you guys design your own rules? So we're not going to tell you what to do. You collectively decide how you should behave. And amazingly, the children chose the same rules, but now they were theirs. And so they kind of followed the rules better because they were their rules. And they could, and the children together could send somebody to detention or suspension or expulsion based on their decisions. So kind of interesting take, but very, very interesting that the schools were free and they have a hard time getting people into them because they're free schools. So they they said they've created this ideal environment where everybody's moving through at their own pace and learning and actively managing themselves, and they can't get enough people in there because it's free. So they said they may have to start charging so that it's more interesting.
Yeah, I mean, look, in education in particular, it's very difficult to change people's habits, uh, largely because we have I mean, look, in game theory, there is this thing called Nash equilibrium. And Nash equilibrium is a situation where you are not necessarily using your best strategy, but you are using your strategy which you believe is the best response to what everybody else is doing.
Mm-hmm.
So, if everybody else is going to schools which are kind of standard conventional schools with, standard curriculum, standard way of teaching, uh, if you deviate from this, as we call in game theory, and if you send your kid to some kind of innovative, disruptive, different school, which does things like you described, what it constitutes uncertainty. So basically, you don't know how the society is going to react
Mm-hmm.
to those who graduated from that kind of school. So it basically generates certain risk. And because you may even believe that that school is going to be better for your kids, but you may think, well, yeah, but it's not worth the risk. So you're basically sticking to this Nash equilibrium, which is essentially to be conforming to what everybody else is doing. And we
Mm-hmm.
know that because of our social skills and because of our social demands, conformity is one of the factors that it's very hard to depart from. I mean, we want to do things the way others are doing, regardless of if we believe that they're doing them rightly or wrongly. It's amazing, as I said in the beginning, it's amazing uh, at the speed of the changes, all sorts of changes, you know, social, economic, behavioral, political, you name it, that we're, we're getting through. Uh, we really have very little sort of uh, clear understanding of how we should react to those challenges. And in particular, I think in the corporate environment, there are lots of CEOs who scratching the backs of their heads thinking what we should be doing. And I think in this respect, all that knowledge that we've accumulated over many years and all the data that we accumulated and the ability to work with this data uh, can be actually put to good use right now.
Absolutely.
There is really no better time than now to suddenly uh, start using those new strategies, new approaches, new engagement kinds. Because under the normal run of events, like I said, it'd be Nash equilibrium, and nobody would be willing to disrupt what they're doing, what gives them good salaries, what gives those companies good profits. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
why bother, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Suddenly, suddenly there is demand for that. So I think if there is anything good that's going to come out of this um disturbing times that we're living in, that's exactly this opportunity for a change, for some disruption. That's something that is going to actually pay dividends for years to come. And this is where knowledge, data, science can be very helpful.
Excellent. Well, Misha, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. I'm sure everybody's going to enjoy the talk. We'll break this down into some modules, edit them to make them look nice, and so on. And then we'll publish one every couple days over the next couple weeks. And I think people are going to enjoy this. It's a good talk. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right. Good to see you.
Good to see you.